Good evening, and welcome back to the Somnorian. Go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lamp if it isn't already, pull the blanket up to wherever you like it, and let the room go quiet around you. Tonight we're spending a few unhurried hours with the medieval imagination at its strangest, wandering through the animals that people in the Middle Ages were absolutely certain existed and behaved in ways that no animal has ever behaved. If you enjoy this sort of slow, meandering trip through history, you can leave a like or subscribe, only if it genuinely adds something to your evenings, never out of obligation. And I'm always curious where you're listening from, so if you feel like it, leave a note in the comments telling me what town, what country, what hour it is where you are. I like imagining the map of everyone drifting off at once. Now settle in, because before we can talk about geese that grow on trees and beavers making terrible decisions, we have to talk about the book that held all of it, the medieval bestiary, one of the strangest and most beloved objects the period ever produced. A bestiary was, on its surface, an animal encyclopedia, a collection of descriptions of beasts, birds, fish, and various things that were none of the above, usually beautifully illustrated, often owned by monasteries or wealthy households, and enormously popular across Western Europe from roughly the 12th century onward. If you picture a modern nature guide, though, the kind with range maps and accurate weights, and a stern commitment to what the animal actually does, you have exactly the wrong idea, because accuracy was never the goal, and in many cases the people writing these books would have found the goal of mere accuracy a bit shallow. The bestiary existed to teach you about God. Every animal in it was a lesson, every strange habit was a signpost pointing at some spiritual truth about sin, salvation, resurrection, or the soul. Whether the habit was real barely mattered, because the moral was the point, and a false fact that delivered a beautiful moral was worth far more than a true fact that delivered nothing. It's a genuinely different way of looking at the world, and once you understand it, 90% of the weirdness we'll cover tonight suddenly makes a kind of sense. The deep root of all this is a single Greek text called the Physiologus, which means roughly the naturalist, compiled by an unknown author in Alexandria sometime around the 2nd or 3rd century, and I want you to sit with how old that is. Because when a 13th century English monk was copying out a fact about a panther, he was passing along a claim that was already close to 1,000 years old and had been recopied, translated, and mangled the entire way. The Physiologus took a few dozen animals, real and imagined, gave each one a memorable trait, and then attached a Christian interpretation to it. It was translated into Latin, then into essentially every European language, and it became one of the most widely circulated books in the medieval West, second only to the Bible in the number of copies and languages it reached. So the whole tradition rests on one anonymous late antique author having a very specific agenda, and everyone downstream treating his output as settled zoology. It is the world's longest game of telephone, played across 1,000 years, in a dozen languages, with the stakes being what people believed about the natural world. To that base, medieval compilers added other authorities, and this is where it helps to know the names, because the same handful of men are responsible for an astonishing share of what educated Europeans knew about animals. There was Pliny the Elder, the Roman writer who died in 79 AD getting too close to the eruption of Vesuvius, and whose natural history was a sprawling 37-book collection of everything he'd read or heard, credulous and sceptical by turns, packed with genuine observation sitting right next to complete nonsense with no warning label separating them. There was Isidore of Seville, a 7th century Spanish bishop who wrote the Etymologiae, an encyclopedia organised around the origins of words, and who operated on the principle that if you understood where a word came from, you understood the thing itself. Isidore's method was to explain an animal by explaining its name, which is a lovely idea and a catastrophic way to do biology, because it meant that a false etymology instantly became a false fact. He wrote, for instance, that the beaver, castor in Latin, was named from castrando to castrate, which we'll return to in a couple of chapters because it is one of the great disasters of the genre. Medieval writers treated Pliny and Isidore as bedrock, and the bestiary tradition simply inherited their errors wholesale, adding a Christian gloss on top. What makes this so different from a modern mistake is the total absence of a correction mechanism, and I think this is the single most important thing to understand about the medieval relationship with the natural world. There was no expectation that you would go and check. A monk in Yorkshire copying a description of an elephant had, in all likelihood, never seen an elephant, would never see one, knew no one who had seen one, and had no way to verify anything he was writing. His job was not to observe the elephant, but to faithfully transmit what the authorities had said about the elephant. And faithful transmission was itself a virtue, a form of humility before the accumulated wisdom of the past. Departing from your sources to insert your own observations wouldn't have looked like rigour. It would have looked like arrogance. So errors didn't get filtered out over time. They got preserved, ornamented, and lovingly recopied, generation after generation, each scribe adding his own small flourishes, until a claim that started as a shaky metaphor in 2nd century Alexandria arrived in a 14th century cloister as unquestioned fact. It's the opposite of how we imagine knowledge working, and it's the reason these beliefs were so stable and so widespread. The system was built for continuity, not accuracy. And these books were expensive, which matters, because it tells you how seriously people took them. A good illustrated bestiary was a luxury object. The parchment alone, animal skin scraped and stretched and cured, represented a small herd of livestock. A substantial manuscript could consume the skins of dozens or even hundreds of animals, which is a quiet irony worth savouring, that a book explaining that the beaver castrates itself out of piety was printed on the tanned hide of a great many actual, non-self-castrating animals. Then came the labour of the scribe, the illuminator, the gold leaf, the ground mineral pigments, lapis lazuli for the blues, shipped overland from what is now Afghanistan and worth more by weight than gold. A finished bestiary was the kind of thing recorded in wills and inventories, given as a gift between nobles, kept in a monastery's treasury. Nobody spent that on a book they considered a collection of fun stories. This was reference material. This was, to the people who owned it, science. The animals inside were sorted with a logic that also isn't ours, and you can feel the medieval mind reaching for order in a way that's genuinely endearing, even when it's wrong. Some bestiaries grouped creatures by where they lived, beasts of the land, birds of the air, fish of the sea, while others followed the order of creation in Genesis, and still others simply followed whatever sequence their source text happened to use, so a lion, a griffin, and an ant might sit as neighbours on the same page with no acknowledgement that one of them was fictional. There was no firm category boundary between animal we have seen, animal we have heard of, and animal from a story, because for the reader they occupied the same shelf. All of them were things that existed somewhere out in a vast and mostly unvisited world, and the world really was mostly unvisited. So who was to say the griffin wasn't simply an animal that lived somewhere the reader had never been? When your direct knowledge ends about 40 miles from your village, the line between the exotic and the impossible gets very blurry, and the bestiary lived entirely inside that blur. It's tempting to laugh at all this, and we're going to, gently, for the next 9 chapters. But I want to plant a flag here at the start and be fair to these people, because they were not stupid, and that's what makes the subject so much richer than a list of silly errors. They were reasoning carefully and often quite rigorously from the information they had, and the information they had was terrible. Inherited from authorities they had every cultural reason to trust, unverifiable by any means available to them, and wrapped in a theology that made the moral of the story more important than the accuracy of the story. Give a modern person the same starting conditions, no way to check anything, a stack of ancient books everyone agrees are authoritative, and a strong incentive to find spiritual meaning in nature, and you'd get something that looks a lot like a bestiary. It's less a story about medieval foolishness than a story about what happens to human reasoning when the feedback loop is broken, when you can be brilliant and careful and still confidently believe that hedgehogs gather fallen fruit by rolling on it until their spines are covered, which, for the record, they were quite sure hedgehogs did. So that's the machinery, and now you know how it works. The anonymous Alexandrian source, the Roman and Spanish authorities layered on top, the monastic scribes who transmitted rather than tested, the luxury manuscripts that made all of it feel authoritative and permanent, and the theology that quietly preferred a good moral to a true fact. Everything strange we're about to explore grows out of this one setup, and I genuinely encourage you to keep it in the back of your mind as we go, because it turns each bizarre belief from a punchline into something more interesting. A little fossil of how people thought, preserved in gold leaf and ground lapis, in a book worth more than a house, explaining with total confidence that geese grow on trees, which is, as it happens, exactly where we're going next. Chapter 2. The Barnacle Goose Problem. There's a food that shows up again and again in medieval European monasteries and noble households, especially in the north, in Ireland, in Scotland, in England, in parts of France and Germany, and it appears on the menu at exactly the times of year when eating that kind of food was strictly forbidden. And the reason it was allowed comes down to one of the most gloriously convenient wrong beliefs the Middle Ages ever produced. The food is goose. The problem is Lent. And the solution medieval Europe arrived at was to decide, with straight faces and considerable scholarly backing, that a certain kind of goose was not a bird at all, but a species of shellfish, or a fruit, or in some accounts a creature that grew hanging from driftwood by its beak, until it was ripe enough to drop into the sea and swim away. To understand why anyone needed this, you have to understand the medieval fasting calendar, which was far more demanding than the modern version and structured the entire year. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, and on a great many other fast days scattered across the calendar, often adding up to well over 100 days a year, the faithful were forbidden from eating meat. And by meat the church meant the flesh of warm-blooded land animals and birds, beef, pork, mutton, chicken, goose, all off the table, sometimes literally. What was permitted was fish, on the logic that fish were creatures of the water, cold and bloodless in the medieval understanding, and therefore a fundamentally different and more austere category of food, suitable for a season of penance. So the entire population spent a substantial fraction of every year sorting the animal kingdom into flesh forbidden and fish allowed, and the stakes of that sorting were spiritual, which meant people paid very close attention to where the lines fell and, being human, looked for places where the lines might be pushed. The barnacle goose sat right on one of those lines, and it did so because of a genuine and understandable mystery. The barnacle goose, Brantoleucopsis, a real bird, black and white and rather handsome, breeds in the high Arctic, in Greenland and Svalbard and the far north of Russia, in places no medieval European ever went. It then migrates south to winter along the coasts of Britain, Ireland and the Low Countries. So Europeans saw these geese arrive every autumn in large numbers and depart every spring, and in all that time no one ever saw a barnacle goose nest or lay an egg or raise a chick, because all of that was happening 2,000 miles away on Arctic cliffs. The birds simply appeared, fully grown, out over the sea. And into that gap in observation, the medieval mind poured an explanation, because a bird that no one had ever seen hatch clearly had to come from somewhere, and the somewhere they landed on was the goose barnacle, a real filter-feeding crustacean that grows in clustered colonies on driftwood and ship timbers, dangling on a long fleshy stalk, with feathery feeding appendages that protrude from the shell and wave in the water. Look at a colony of goose barnacles with a medieval eye, and the theory almost writes itself. The barnacle has a shell that could be imagined as an egg or a bud. It hangs from a stalk that looks like a neck. It produces those dark, feathery, waving filaments that a hopeful observer could read as the beginnings of plumage, and it grows on exactly the driftwood and coastal timber where you might expect to find a seabird's origins. The name itself did the rest of the work, because in the topsy-turvy logic of medieval etymology, the fact that the bird and the shellfish shared the name barnacle was not a coincidence to be explained, but proof of a shared nature, evidence that the two were stages of one creature. And so the settled account became this. The goose barnacle grows on wood in the sea, ripens, and from it emerges the barnacle goose, which drops into the water fully feathered and flies away. A bird with no egg, no nest, and no parents, generated directly from timber and salt water. The single best source on this is a man named Gerald of Wales, Giraldus Cambrensis, a well-travelled, sharp-eyed cleric who wrote a book called the Topographia Hibernica, an account of Ireland, around 1188. Gerald describes the barnacle geese in detail, says plainly that they are produced from a kind of shellfish clinging to driftwood, that he has seen with his own eyes the little bird bodies hanging from the timber by their beaks, and that these geese therefore come into being contrary to the ordinary course of nature. And then Gerald does something wonderful. He immediately notices the loophole and gets irritated about it. He reports that in parts of Ireland, clergymen were eating these geese during fasting periods, reasoning that since the birds were not born of flesh, they did not count as flesh. Gerald thinks this is a scandal and an abuse. He argues that whatever their bizarre origin, the geese plainly live and behave as birds, and that eating them in Lent is a sin dressed up in bad logic, which makes Gerald in 1188 the earliest voice in a very long argument, and firmly the killjoy in it. What I love about this is that the barnacle goose belief wasn't primarily driven by hunger for weird science. It was driven by hunger for goose, and the science was recruited afterward to justify the dinner. If the barnacle goose is a fish, or fish adjacent, a creature of the water born from sea timber rather than from an egg, then it is fair game during Lent, a rich roasted bird on the table in the middle of the season when your neighbours are choking down salt cod. This is the single most delicious loophole in medieval theology, and I mean that in every sense. It transformed a gap in ornithological knowledge into a menu upgrade, and a great many people were highly motivated to keep believing it precisely because disbelieving it would cost them the goose. Gerald was not the last word. The belief had real staying power and real defenders across centuries and countries. It appears in encyclopedic works throughout the later Middle Ages, repeated by serious writers who had no way to check it, and every reason to accept an explanation that fit the visible facts. Geese that appear from nowhere, shellfish that look vaguely bird-adjacent, a shared name. It was still being seriously discussed in learned circles well into the early modern period. As late as the 17th century, the English botanist John Gerard included in his famous herbal an account of barnacle geese growing from a tree bearing shell-like fruit, complete with an illustration, describing it as something he could personally vouch for, which he could not because it does not happen. But the tradition was old and respectable enough that a serious naturalist could still repeat it in print more than 400 years after Gerald first wrote it down. The Church, for its part, never fully settled the matter, and different authorities came down in different places, which only extended the argument. The most decisive push against the loophole came much later, from the very top. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, under Pope Innocent III, it was ruled that barnacle geese were to be regarded as birds, and were therefore forbidden during Lent, on the sensible ground that whatever the story about their origin, they lived exactly as other water birds did. But a papal ruling in 1215 tells you something important. It tells you that people were still eating barnacle geese during Lent in enough numbers, and defending the practice with enough conviction, that the highest council of the Church felt the need to shut it down by name. You don't formally ban a loophole that no one is using. The ruling is proof of just how popular the dodge had become, and the belief survived even the ban, because a good story with a good dinner attached to it does not die on the say-so of a council. Regional practice continued in places. The barnacle goose as shellfish idea kept surfacing in books for centuries, and the whole thing only really dissolved when naturalists finally started tracing bird migration, and someone eventually found the actual nests in the actual Arctic, and confirmed that barnacle geese hatch from ordinary eggs laid on ordinary cliffs like every other goose. The mystery had a completely mundane answer the entire time. The birds were just breeding somewhere no one had thought to look. But for the better part of 1,000 years, the far more entertaining answer held the field, largely because a lot of hungry, pious people in cold northern monasteries very much wanted it to. There's a deeper pattern here that's worth pausing on, because it's going to recur all night. The barnacle goose belief has the same skeleton as a huge amount of medieval animal lore. A genuine gap in observation, filled by a superficial resemblance, locked into place by a coincidence of language, and then held there by a strong incentive, theological, moral, or in this case culinary, not to look too closely. It wasn't stupidity, given that no one could follow the geese to the Arctic, given that the shellfish really does look strangely bird-like, given that the two things shared a name, and given that the alternative was cod for 6 weeks. The barnacle goose theory was almost a reasonable place for the medieval mind to land. It was wrong from top to bottom, but it was wrong for reasons you can trace and even sympathise with, and it kept goose on the table through Lent for a very long time, which, from the perspective of a 14th century monk, might well have felt like the theory working exactly as intended. Chapter 3, The Beaver's Terrible Bargain. The beavers. Of all the animal beliefs the Middle Ages handed down, there is one that stands out for a very specific reason. It is not merely wrong, it is anatomically impossible in a way that anyone could have checked. And it survived for well over 1,000 years anyway, illustrated in manuscript after manuscript, preached from as a model of Christian virtue, and traceable back through the same chain of authorities we met in the first chapter. It concerns the beaver, and it concerns the beaver's testicles, and I promise you that the medieval version of this story is stranger than anything you're bracing for. The claim, stated plainly, was this: when a beaver is being hunted, it knows the hunter wants only one thing from it, a substance produced near its genitals, and so, to save its life, the beaver bites off its own testicles, throws them to the pursuing hunter, and escapes. And if it should ever be chased a second time, the beaver rears up and displays the fact that it has nothing left to give, at which point the disappointed hunter lets it go. Let's start with the one true thing at the centre of all this, because as always there is a real fact holding up the fantasy. Beavers produce a substance called castoreum, a thick, musky, yellowish secretion that comes from a pair of sacs called castor sacs, located near the base of the tail in the general vicinity of the animal's rear. And castoreum was genuinely seriously valuable in the medieval and ancient world. It was used in medicine as a remedy for an enormous range of complaints, prescribed for headaches, fevers, cramps, and disorders of the womb. It was used in perfumery for its deep animal scent, and demand for it was real and sustained enough that beavers were hunted specifically to obtain it. So the foundation is solid. There really was a prized substance. It really did come from near the beaver's hindquarters, and hunters really were after that specific part of the animal. Everything after that is where it goes gorgeously wrong. The error starts predictably with a name and a bad guess about where that name came from. Isidore of Seville, our 7th century bishop with the encyclopedia and the deep faith in etymology, recorded that the beaver was called castor in Latin because of castrando, to castrate, and once you have a respected authority telling you the animal's very name means the one who castrates, the story practically demands to exist. The castor sacs, the source of the castoreum, sit close enough to the beaver's genitals that a person working from description rather than dissection could easily conflate the two, could hear the valuable stuff comes from down there and the animal is named for castration, and assemble them into a single tidy narrative. The beaver removes its own valuable parts and hands them over. The etymology came first in a sense, and the biology was reverse engineered to fit it, which is exactly backward from how it should work, and exactly typical of how Isidore worked. But Isidore was only passing along something older, because this one, like so much of the tradition, traces back through the ancients. The self-castrating beaver appears in the Physiologus, that root text from Alexandria, and it appears in Pliny, and versions of it go back further still to Greek writers like Aesop, who used it as a fable, and in the fable form the point is a piece of survival wisdom, the lesson being that a wise man, when pursued, will give up his valuables to save his life. So the story arrived in medieval Europe already ancient, already carrying a moral, already vouched for by the most authoritative names available. A monk encountering it wasn't hearing a rumour. He was receiving a claim signed by Pliny and Isidore and the Physiologus all at once, which was about as authoritative as a claim could get, and the fact that it was also completely untrue was not something the system was built to catch. Now here is where the medieval version pulls decisively ahead of the ancient one, because the Christian bestiary took this already strange fable and gave it a moral so specific and so vivid that it became one of the genre's signature set pieces. The interpretation went like this. The hunter is the devil. The beaver is the good Christian. The testicles are the Christian's sins or his vices, or all the sinful attachments of his life. And the lesson is that a person who wishes to live chastely and escape the devil must cut off from himself every vice and every impure act and fling them, so to speak, in the devil's face, must voluntarily and completely renounce sin, casting it away from his own body, so that when the devil comes hunting he finds nothing in the man to grab hold of. The bestiary then delivers the payoff, describing how the beaver, chased a second time, rears up to show the hunter it has already been rendered harmless, and the hunter departs, just as the devil, finding a truly reformed man with nothing sinful left in him, gives up and goes away. I want to sit with how strange this is as a piece of religious instruction, because it really is a rare case where the moral is weirder than the anatomy. The lesson is genuinely a good one by the standards of medieval Christian teaching. Renounce your vices utterly, give the devil nothing to work with, and he'll lose interest in you. It's coherent, it's memorable, it's the kind of thing that would stick in a congregation's mind. But the image chosen to carry that perfectly respectable lesson is a rodent performing self-castration, and then flashing its assailant to prove the deed is done, and this was preached in churches, painted in the margins of expensive devotional manuscripts, and treated as edifying spiritual content suitable for the whole community. The gap between the dignity of the intended message and the absurdity of the chosen mascot is, to me, one of the purest pleasures the bestiary tradition offers. Somewhere a medieval preacher stood before his flock and, with total sincerity, held up the self-gelding beaver as a model for the pious soul. The manuscript illustrations make it all the more delightful, because the illuminators had to draw this, and they drew it with commitment. Bestiary pages across Europe show the beaver, usually a slightly baffled-looking creature, often more dog than rodent, because the artists had frequently never seen a beaver either, and were working from description, twisting around to bite at its own hindquarters, sometimes mid-flight with a hunter and hounds bearing down behind it, sometimes already reduced and rearing up to display the results to a pursuer who looks appropriately let down. Some versions get the anatomy of the animal wildly wrong in other ways too, giving it webbed feet on the wrong limbs or a fish's tail, because once you're already this far from reality, the details hardly matter. These are not embarrassed illustrations. They are confident, careful, sometimes beautiful drawings of a thing that never happened, executed by artists who took the subject entirely seriously. And it is worth saying clearly just how impossible the belief is, because it isn't a small exaggeration of a real behaviour. There is no real behaviour here at all. A beaver's testicles are internal. They sit inside the body, not in an external sac, which means they are not accessible for the animal to bite off even if it wanted to, which it does not. Because no animal engages in self-castration as a survival strategy, and the caster sacs that everyone was actually after are a completely separate structure that has nothing to do with reproduction. So the belief is wrong at every single layer. The beaver cannot reach its testicles, would not remove them if it could, and the valuable substance the hunters wanted was never stored in the testicles in the first place. It is a fiction built on a fiction built on a mispronounced etymology, and a person could have disproved the whole thing at any point across 1,000 years with one dead beaver and a moment's honest attention, which is precisely what the tradition was structured never to require. The staying power is the part that should genuinely give us pause, because this wasn't a fringe belief that a few gullible people held. It was mainstream, endorsed, taught, and illustrated across the entire span of the medieval period and beyond, surviving in natural history writing well into the early modern era, still being repeated and gently questioned by naturalists centuries after the Middle Ages had ended. Its durability came from the same machinery we've watched all night. It was vouched for by the great ancient authorities. It carried a moral too good to discard. It required first-hand dissection to disprove, and first-hand dissection was exactly the sort of vulgar, hands-on checking that the transmit-don't-test culture of medieval scholarship never valued. The beaver story didn't survive despite being useful. It survived because it was useful. A ready-made sermon, an easy illustration, a memorable lesson, and its usefulness had absolutely nothing to do with whether it was true. There is one last irony worth savouring before we leave the beaver alone, and it's a quiet one. The whole tradition was built to teach men to renounce their attachments and give up their worldly goods to escape a pursuer. And the beavers, meanwhile, were being hunted to genuine scarcity across large parts of Europe for the very real castoreum they very rarely produced, not giving anything up at all but having it taken, their populations crashing in region after region over the centuries. The medieval Christian was told to imitate the beaver's noble self-sacrifice. The actual beaver made no sacrifice, noble or otherwise. It was simply killed for a gland it had no say over, by hunters who had been told a bedtime story about the animal's willing generosity. A story that made the killing feel almost like something the beaver had consented to. The fable asked the beaver to teach us about giving things up freely, while we took everything from it by force. That's the beaver's terrible bargain, and it was terrible mostly for the beaver. Chapter 4. Lions, Bears, and the Art of Being Born Wrong. We've spent 2 chapters on the strange things medieval Europeans believed about how animals lived. Now I want to spend one on something even more fundamental, which is how they believed animals came into being in the first place. Because the medieval mind had some remarkable ideas about birth, about the shaping of newborn creatures, and about how the youngest animals arrived in the world. And these ideas map so neatly and so deliberately onto Christian doctrine that you can practically watch the theology steering the biology. Tonight's 3 main characters are the bear cub that had to be licked into existence, the lion cub that spent 3 days dead before being breathed back to life, and, along the way, a supporting cast of animals whose reproduction was quietly rewritten to make a spiritual point. The unifying idea is that being born wrong, born incomplete, born dead, born by some route other than the ordinary one, was not a defect in these stories, but the whole point, because a strange birth could be made to say something a normal birth could not. Start with the bear, and with a phrase you have almost certainly used without knowing where it came from. When we say a rough person has been licked into shape, we are quoting, directly and unknowingly, a medieval belief about bears, the belief that bear cubs are born as shapeless lumps of flesh, formless little masses with no distinct features, and that the mother bear literally licks them into their proper bear shape with her tongue, sculpting the eyes and legs and snout out of raw unformed matter through patient grooming. This wasn't a metaphor to the people who recorded it. It was a description of what they believed physically happened. The bear was thought to give birth to something barely alive and wholly unformed, and then to author her own offspring the way a sculptor works clay, tongue against flesh, until a recognisable cub emerged from the shapeless beginning. As always, there's a thread of real observation underneath the fantasy, and it's worth pulling on because it shows how a reasonable person could land here. Bear cubs genuinely are born tiny and helpless to a degree that's startling if you know the size of the adult. A newborn is a fraction of a percent of its mother's weight, blind, nearly hairless, utterly undeveloped compared to, say, a newborn foal that stands within the hour. Mother bears do lick their cubs extensively, as many mammals do, for cleaning and stimulation and warmth. And crucially, bears give birth in the depths of winter, deep inside a den, in hibernation. Adjacent seclusion where no human was ever going to watch the process. So once again we have the exact recipe from Chapter 1. A genuinely unusual real phenomenon, a birth no one could observe directly, and a gap in knowledge waiting to be filled by inference. Someone saw an astonishingly underdeveloped newborn and a mother constantly licking it, never saw the birth itself, and concluded that the licking was doing the shaping. It's wrong, but you can see the hand reaching for the wrong answer. Pliny recorded the licked into shape bear, Isidore repeated it, and by the medieval period it was simply a known fact of natural history, and here the etymology-obsessed Isidore did his usual trick, deriving the Latin for bear cub, ursus, from orsus, meaning a beginning, or something begun, on the reasoning that the cub was a mere beginning, an unfinished draft of a bear that the mother completed afterward. The theological weight the bear could carry was modest compared to some, but it was there. The shapeless cub, perfected by loving attention, became an image of the sinner, or the untaught soul, formless and rough until shaped by the church, by instruction, by grace. The raw human material licked into its proper spiritual shape by a patient higher power. The lesson was gentle, and the image was memorable, and once again a piece of completely false biology earned its long life by being useful in a sermon. Now the lion, which is the heavyweight of this chapter, because the lion carried more symbolic freight than almost any animal in the entire bestiary, and its supposed birth habits were engineered to carry the single, most important doctrine in Christianity. The belief was this: lion cubs are born dead. They come into the world lifeless and inert, showing no sign of life at all, and they remain dead for 3 days, until the father lion comes to them on the 3rd day, breathes into their faces or roars over them, and the breath or the roar of the father restores the dead cubs to life. If you have spent any time near a church, the shape of that story is ringing a very loud bell, and it is supposed to. The lion cub, dead for 3 days and then raised to life by the father, was read as a direct figure of Christ, dead in the tomb for 3 days and raised by God the Father, and this was one of the most cherished and widely repeated interpretations in the whole tradition, precisely because it made the lion a walking prophecy of the resurrection. The lion, in fact, got a whole cluster of these traits, each one attached to a doctrine, and it's worth laying them out because it shows the machinery running at full capacity. The bestiaries typically gave the lion 3 natures. The first was that when the lion senses hunters pursuing him, he sweeps away his tracks with his tail so he cannot be followed, read as Christ concealing his divinity, veiling his heavenly nature during his time on earth so that the pursuing enemy could not recognize him. The second was that the lion sleeps with his eyes open, ever watchful even in rest, read as Christ's body sleeping in death upon the cross, while his divine nature remained awake and watchful, the God who neither slumbers nor sleeps. And the third was the resurrection of the 3 days dead cubs by the Father's breath. 3 traits, 3 doctrines, 1 animal, the vigilance of God, the hidden divinity of Christ, and the resurrection itself, all stitched onto the lion so thoroughly that the lion became less an animal than an illustrated creed. None of the three is true, of course, and it's almost beside the point to say so, but let's be precise about it. Lions do not erase their tracks with their tails. Lion cubs are born alive, blind and helpless, but unmistakably alive, and are not dead for 3 days awaiting paternal resuscitation. And lions sleep like other big cats, which is to say a great deal, and with their eyes shut. The male lion, far from breathing life into his cubs, is in reality a documented threat to them. Males taking over a pride will frequently kill the existing cubs, the precise opposite of the tender resurrecting father the bestiary imagined. But you can see why the truth was never going to dislodge the story, a belief that lets you point at the king of beasts and say, "Behold, a prophecy of the resurrection walking the earth," is not a belief that gets discarded because someone reports the cubs looked lively enough at birth. The doctrine was doing the driving, and the lion's real behaviour was never invited into the conversation. I find the lion especially revealing because it shows the direction of causation so nakedly. With the barnacle goose and the beaver, you can argue that a misunderstanding came first and the moral was bolted on afterward. With the lion's 3-day dead cubs, it's very hard to escape the suspicion that the doctrine came first and the fact was shaped to fit it, that someone who wanted an animal world echo of the resurrection reached for the noblest available beast and simply assigned it the necessary biography. The number 3, the death, the father, the breath-restoring life, these are not details you arrive at by watching lions. They are details you arrive at by reading the Gospels and then going looking for a lion to hang them on. The bestiary tradition wasn't always observation dressed up in theology. Sometimes it was theology handing out costumes, and the lion wore the most important costume in the wardrobe. The same instinct shaped beliefs about other animals' births and origins, and a few are worth gathering here to show how pervasive this was. The eagle was said to be able to renew its youth by flying up toward the sun to burn away the mist over its aging eyes, then plunging 3 times into a fountain to emerge young again, a figure of baptism and spiritual renewal, the old self drowned and the new self rising. The phoenix, that famous bird, was believed to build its own pyre, burn itself to ash, and rise reborn from the ashes on the 3rd day, which made it perhaps the single most on-the-nose resurrection symbol available and got it enormous play in Christian writing despite being entirely mythical. And the pelican, which will give a full chapter of its own shortly, was believed to revive its own dead young with its blood. Notice the pattern threading through all of them: death and rebirth, the 3rd day, renewal, a parent restoring a child to life. The medieval imagination kept finding the resurrection everywhere in the animal kingdom, because it kept putting the resurrection there. There's something almost touching in all of this once you stop laughing, and I want to close the chapter on it, because it tells you what these people were actually doing. They lived in a world they believed to be densely, thoroughly meaningful, a world where God had authored not only scripture but nature itself, and where the animals were understood as a second book, a book of creatures written by the same hand and expressing the same truths, if only you knew how to read it. Under that assumption, finding the resurrection encoded in the lion or baptism encoded in the eagle wasn't wishful thinking. It was exactly what you'd expect to find, because a God who wanted to teach humanity would naturally have written his lessons into his creatures as well as his book. The biology was wrong at nearly every turn. The cubs were alive and the tracks unswept, and the bear cubs already bear-shaped at birth. But the impulse behind the errors was a coherent and even beautiful one, a conviction that the world was legible, that nothing in it was accidental, and that even the birth of a bear cub in a dark winter den was, if you looked closely enough, a sentence in a story about God. They were wrong about the animals. They were not wrong to think the animals were worth reading. Chapter 5. The Pelican Opens a Vein. Walk into an old European church, or open a piece of medieval or Renaissance heraldry, or look closely at the carved and painted decoration around an altar, and sooner or later you will find a particular image repeated with obvious reverence. A mother bird standing over a nest of chicks, her long neck bent down, her beak pressed against her own breast, and drops of blood falling from the wound she has made in herself onto the young below. The bird is a pelican, the pose has a formal name, the pelican in her piety, and the belief behind it was one of the most emotionally powerful and widely embraced in the entire animal law tradition, precisely because it was so tender and so sad. The pelican, medieval Europe believed, loved its children so much that it would tear open its own chest and feed them with its blood, and in some versions would revive its own dead offspring by pouring its lifeblood over them, giving its life to give them theirs. Let me give you the full version as the bestiaries told it, because the details matter, and they varied in ways that are themselves revealing. The core story is that the mother pelican wounds her own breast with her beak and lets her blood fall upon her chicks to nourish them. But the more dramatic and more popular version added a darker first act. The pelican, it was said, is a devoted but troubled parent, and her chicks, as they grow, strike back at her, pecking at her face, striking their mother, provoking her, until in a moment of anger or grief she kills them, or they die, and the nest falls silent with the young lying dead. Then the mother, overcome with sorrow at what has happened, wounds her own side, and by shedding her blood over the lifeless chicks she brings them back to life, reviving them with the very substance she draws from her own body. She kills, she mourns, she opens her veins, and she resurrects. And then, having given her blood, she's often depicted as weakened or dying herself. You do not need me to spell out the theological reading because it spells itself, but the directness is the whole point and worth stating plainly. The pelican is Christ. The blood shed from the breast is the blood of Christ shed on the cross. The dead chicks revived by that blood are humanity. Dead in sin, brought back to life by the sacrifice. And the image of a parent giving her own lifeblood to resurrect her dead children was about as pure and complete a figure of the crucifixion and redemption as the animal world could possibly offer. This is why the pelican in her piety appears on altars, on tabernacles, on chalices, in stained glass, in the decoration of the very furniture of the Mass, where the blood of Christ was central to the whole ritual. The bird wasn't a quaint zoological curiosity here. It was a compact, vivid, deeply moving symbol of the single most important event in the Christian story, and it earned its place in the most sacred spaces precisely because the story it told mapped so perfectly onto the sacrifice being commemorated there. The pelican's prestige climbed about as high as an animal symbol could climb, and a couple of examples show just how seriously it was taken at the highest levels of culture. It found its way into heraldry as an emblem of self-sacrifice and devoted love, chosen by families and institutions who wanted to advertise exactly those virtues. Corpus Christi College at both Oxford and Cambridge took the pelican as its symbol, appropriate for institutions named for the body of Christ, since the pelican feeding its young with its own blood was a natural companion image to the Eucharist. Great theologians reached for it. Thomas Aquinas, the towering intellect of medieval Christianity, invoked the pelican in a Eucharistic hymn, addressing Christ as the loving pelican whose blood cleanses and heals, which tells you that this belief wasn't confined to credulous margins or popular superstition, but sat comfortably in the writing of the most rigorous mind the age produced. When Aquinas is putting the self-wounding pelican into a hymn, the belief has arrived at the very centre of the culture. So where on earth did it come from? Because a bird stabbing its own chest to bleed on its children is a strangely specific thing to invent. And the answer, as usual, is that there's a kernel of real observation twisted into an unrecognisable shape. Several ordinary facts about pelicans could have seeded the story. Pelicans have that large pouch beneath a long bill, and they feed their young by regurgitating fish from it, lowering the bill against the breast and letting the chicks reach up into it. So a person watching from a distance, seeing the adult press its bill down toward its chest, while the young pushed their heads against it and fed, could very reasonably read the scene as the chicks feeding directly from the parent's breast. Some pelican species have a reddish tinge on the breast, or at the tip of the bill during breeding season, which a hopeful eye could take for blood or for the sight of a self-inflicted wound. And pelicans, when resting, sometimes press the bill down against the neck and breast in a posture that looks, if you're already primed to see it, exactly like a bird stabbing itself. Real bird, real behaviours, real coloration, assembled by observers who couldn't get close and who are reading everything through a theological lens into a completely false but emotionally overwhelming story. The belief goes back, like the others, to the ancient root. The physiologus and the writers who followed it carried the self-wounding pelican forward, and Isidore, of course, found an etymology to bless it, though the derivations here are murkier than usual. What's more interesting than the pedigree is how the story mutated over time, because the pelican is a good case study in a belief getting more elaborate and more theologically pointed the longer it circulated. The earliest versions are relatively simple. The bird feeds its young with its blood. The later, fuller versions add the whole tragic arc, the chicks striking the parent killing them, the 3-day wait in some tellings, the resurrection by blood, the parent's own death. Each edition pulls the story closer to the Passion narrative, adding a betrayal, a death, a period of waiting, a resurrection, a sacrifice unto death. And you can watch the belief being sculpted across centuries into an ever tighter fit with the doctrine it was being used to illustrate. The pelican didn't just happen to resemble Christ. Generations of retelling gradually filed off the parts that didn't fit and sharpened the parts that did. It's worth pausing on how genuinely affecting this image was to the people who held it, because it would be easy to file the pelican alongside the self-castrating beaver as another absurdity, and that would miss something true about it. The beaver is funny, the pelican is not, and it was never meant to be. This was an image people prayed in front of. A grieving parent kneeling at an altar carved with a pelican in her piety, contemplating a mother who tore open her own body to bring her dead children back to life. That person was not being entertained by a piece of bad ornithology. They were being consoled by one of the most powerful images their culture had for love that survives death, for sacrifice that redeems, for a parent's blood spent to give a child life. The belief was false as biology and profound as symbol, and to the medieval Christian the second thing mattered infinitely more than the first, which is the whole thesis of this channel, compressed into a single bleeding bird. The image outlived the belief by centuries, and that outliving is itself the tidy final irony. Long after naturalists had established that pelicans feed their chicks perfectly ordinary regurgitated fish, and do not wound themselves at all, the pelican in her piety remained, and remains, a standard heraldic charge, a fixture of church art, a symbol still legible to anyone who knows the tradition, still stamped on college crests and carved into altarpieces that people walk past every day. The factual belief died quietly, as factual beliefs do once someone finally looks closely. Nobody today thinks pelicans bleed for their young, but the symbol was always the durable part, because the symbol never depended on the fact. It depended on the meaning, and the meaning of a parent giving their lifeblood to save their children is not something a corrected biology can touch. The medieval mind built a piece of theology on a mistaken bird, and the theology proved sturdier than the mistake, standing long after the mistake had been quietly swept away, still bending its neck toward its breast in 1,000 old churches, still bleeding in stone and glass, for children that were never in any danger at all. Chapter 6. Bees, the perfect little citizens. If you had asked an educated person in the Middle Ages to name the most virtuous animal in all creation, the one whose way of life a good Christian ought to study and imitate, a great many of them would not have named the noble lion or the faithful dog but the honeybee, and they would have meant it with complete seriousness, because the bee occupied a strange and elevated place in the medieval mind that no other insect came close to. The bee was held up as a model of chastity, of obedience, of tireless labour, of loyal service to a rightful ruler, and of pure communal harmony, a tiny, buzzing ideal of exactly the ordered, pious, hard-working society that medieval writers wished humans could manage. And the reason this is such rich territory for us is that medieval bee lore is a genuine tangle of real, hard-won, practical knowledge sitting right beside total zoological fantasy, so that the same writer who could tell you sensible things about managing a hive would also tell you, with equal confidence, that bees are born from the rotting carcasses of oxen and are ruled by a king. Let's start with that second claim, because it's the foundational error and everything else is built around it. Medieval Europe believed that the bee at the centre of the hive, the large one the whole colony organised itself around, was a king, a male monarch. The idea that the colony was led by a queen, a female, was simply not part of the picture, and this wasn't a minor slip. It shaped the entire way bees were understood and moralised. The king bee was described as larger and more beautiful than the others, marked out by nature for rule, merciful and just, and the bestiaries and encyclopedias praised the wonderful loyalty of the workers to their king, the way they surrounded and protected him, the way they would not abandon him. This became a lesson in proper political order, and in the loyalty owed to a rightful lord. The hive is a perfect little kingdom, every subject knowing its place and serving faithfully, the sort of harmonious feudal society that existed far more reliably in the beehive of the imagination than in any actual medieval kingdom. The truth, which no one would establish firmly until well after the Middle Ages, is that the large central bee is a queen, female, the mother of essentially the entire colony, and the reproductive heart of the hive rather than its merciful sovereign. The workers, those tireless labourers praised for their industry and chastity, are also female, sterile females who do not reproduce. And the drones, the actual males of the colony, do essentially none of the celebrated work and exist mainly to mate. So the medieval account got the sex of the ruler wrong, got the sex of the workers wrong, and completely inverted which members of the colony were doing the labour. The praised for chastity workers were female, the idle drones were the males, and the noble king was a mother laying thousands of eggs. Nearly every element of the moral picture was built on a factual error about who these bees actually were, and the errors all ran in the same direction, toward a male-ruled, patriarchal social order that matched the world the writers already lived in and approved of. You can hardly blame them for the confusion, and it's worth being fair about why, because seeing a queen bee for what she is requires exactly the kind of close, sustained observation that was hard to come by. Inside a hive of many thousands of nearly identical insects, in the dark, in a crush of constant movement, the queen is not obviously giving orders. She's simply present, surrounded, attended, and a beekeeper who noticed that the colony organised itself around one special bee and fell apart without her, could very reasonably conclude that this was the ruler without ever being able to observe that ruling here meant laying eggs, and the cultural expectation did the rest. In a world where rule meant kingship, where authority was male by default, the assumption that the leader of any well-ordered society must be a king was so deep that the possibility of a queen bee barely registered as a question worth asking. They saw a monarch because they were looking for a monarch, and the sex of that monarch was decided before anyone ever looked into a hive. Now for the oxen, because this is the belief that most delights me, and it has one of the longest and most respectable pedigrees of anything we'll discuss all night. Medieval Europe widely accepted that bees could be generated spontaneously from the decaying body of a dead ox or cow, that if you killed an ox in a certain way, sealed it up, and left it to rot, a fresh swarm of bees would eventually emerge from the putrefying carcass, fully formed and ready to work. This process even had a name in the ancient sources, begonia, meaning roughly ox birth, and it came with detailed practical instructions. How to beat the animal to death without breaking the skin, how to close up the openings of the body, in what kind of enclosed space to leave it, and how long to wait before the bees appeared from the rotting flesh. This was not a vague superstition. It was presented as an agricultural technique, a method for producing bees, with steps you could follow. The reason this belief was so durable is that it came straight from the most admired authority imaginable. Virgil, the great Roman poet, described begonia at length in the Georgics, his revered poem about farming, telling the story of a beekeeper who loses his swarm and regenerates it from the carcasses of cattle. When your source for a piece of agricultural science is Virgil, read, memorized, and venerated throughout the medieval period as one of the supreme voices of the classical world, you do not lightly set it aside, and the spontaneous generation of bees from oxen rode that prestige for well over 1,000 years. It fit too with the whole medieval acceptance of spontaneous generation as a real phenomenon. Maggots seem to arise from meat, and other small creatures seem to appear from mud and rot, so the idea that life could bloom directly from decay was not strange to them at all. Bees from a dead ox was merely a particularly grand and useful example of something everyone already believed happened all the time. There is even a real-world ghost of an explanation for how the ox birth belief might have gotten started, and it's a satisfying one. There exists a kind of fly, a drone fly, whose adults look remarkably like honeybees, close enough to fool a casual eye, and whose larvae genuinely do develop in stagnant, rotting, waterlogged organic matter of exactly the sort a decomposing carcass would produce. So it is entirely plausible that someone, at some point in the deep past, left a dead animal in a wet place, returned later to find it swarming with buzzing, bee-looking insects rising from the rot, and concluded that the carcass had generated bees, when what had actually happened was that bee-mimicking flies had bred in the decay. A real observation, a genuine resemblance, and a completely wrong conclusion, transmitted through Virgil into the permanent record. It is the barnacle goose all over again in a different key, a gap between what was seen and what was really happening, filled by the most sensible-seeming inference available, and then locked in place by an unimpeachable source. Set against all this fantasy, though, is something that deserves genuine respect, because the medieval world also knew a great deal about bees that was true and practically useful. and the two bodies of knowledge lived side by side in the same texts without any apparent discomfort. Beekeepers understood how to manage hives, how to encourage swarming and capture new swarms, how to harvest honey and wax without destroying the colony, when the bees were active and when they rested. Monasteries in particular were serious apiarists because they needed beeswax in enormous quantities for candles. The church consumed a staggering amount of wax for its rituals, and honey as one of the only concentrated sweeteners available in a world without sugar. So the same monastery that recorded the bee's king and the bee's birth from oxen was also running a genuinely competent operation producing wax and honey at scale, holding accurate working knowledge and total zoological fiction in the same hands at the same time, and seeing no contradiction between them because the practical knowledge answered, "How do we get honey?" while the fictions answered, "What does the bee teach us about God?" And those were simply different questions. The moral uses of the bee were where all this came together, and they were relentless, because the bee could be made to preach almost any virtue you needed. Its supposed chastity, the workers were thought to reproduce without sex, to be born from the ox or from flowers rather than from mating, and so to live in perfect purity, made the bee a model for monks and nuns, an insect that had achieved the celibate ideal the religious life aspired to. Its industry made it a rebuke to idleness, its production of sweetness and light from humble labour, an image of the soul's proper work, its loyalty to its king a lesson in obedience to Lord and to God, its cooperative hive a picture of the ideal Christian community, where each member laboured selflessly for the common good under a just ruler. Writers assembled these into elaborate comparisons, and at least one substantial medieval work used the beehive as a sustained allegory for the well-ordered religious community, walking through the hive point by point and drawing out the lesson in each feature. The bee was, in effect, a sermon with wings, and nearly everything the sermon said about it was biologically false and moral gold. What I find most human in all of this is the sheer wanting behind it, the way the medieval imagination looked at the bee and saw not what was there, but what it longed to see, a society that actually worked. Because the world these writers lived in did not run like the idealized hive, it was full of disloyalty and disorder, of lords who were not merciful and subjects who were not faithful, of labour grudgingly given and communities riven by conflict. And here, seemingly, was a creature that had solved all of it, a whole society labouring in cheerful harmony, chaste and industrious and utterly loyal, every member content in its station, producing sweetness and light without complaint under a just and gentle king. They got the sex of the ruler wrong, the origin of the bees wrong, the biology wrong from nearly every angle, but the error was powered by a genuine and rather moving hope, that somewhere in creation, even if only among the insects, the good society they couldn't build for themselves already existed, humming quietly in a wooden box in the monastery garden, showing them every day exactly how it was supposed to be done. Chapter 7. Here be the sea's nonsense. If the medieval imagination ran a little wild with land animals, it could actually see. Imagine what it did with the sea, because the ocean in the Middle Ages was as close to genuinely unknowable as any part of the world got. A vast, dark, storm-racked expanse that swallowed ships and men without explanation, and gave almost nothing back in the way of reliable information. Sailors went out and some did not return. Those who did came home with stories, and there was no way whatsoever to check any of it, no way to see beneath the surface, no way to distinguish a real creature glimpsed in a storm from a tall tale polished over years of retelling in dockside taverns. So the sea became the single richest canvas for animal fantasy in the entire medieval world, a place where you could believe more or less anything, because the ocean had 1,000 years of sailors' testimony behind every claim, and no possible way for anyone to prove a single word of it wrong. Tonight's waters hold an island that is really a fish, a saw-backed monster that races ships, and a whole menagerie of sea beasts imagined as underwater copies of the animals on land. Start with the most famous and, in a quiet way, the most poignant of all the sea legends, the great whale so enormous that sailors mistake it for an island. The story, which appears again and again across the medieval world, runs like this. There is a sea monster of tremendous size, called the aspidokelon in the old texts, sometimes described as a whale, sometimes as a giant turtle-like creature, whose vast back rises above the surface of the water and is covered with sand and stones and vegetation, so that it looks for all the world like a small island or a low sandy shore. Sailors, weary and looking for a place to rest, land their ships upon it, disembark, and build a fire to cook their food. And the beast, feeling the heat of the fire on its back, wakes and dives, plunging suddenly into the depths and dragging the ship and every soul aboard down with it to drown. The island was alive the whole time, and the men who trusted it die for the mistake. The moral reading here is characteristically neat, and by now you can probably supply it yourself, but it's worth spelling out because it made the Whale Island one of the most preached upon sea creatures in the bestiary. The great beast is the devil, the sailors are human souls, the deceptive island is the false security of worldly and sinful things, which seems solid and safe and inviting, a good place to rest, right up until you commit yourself fully to them, at which point they plunge you into the depths and destroy you. The lesson was that the things of this world offer a treacherous footing, that what looks like solid ground beneath your feet may be the back of the devil himself, and that the soul which anchors its ship to sin will be dragged down when it least expects it. The whale had a second habit in these accounts too. It was said to emit a sweet fragrance from its mouth that lured small fish in, whereupon it swallowed them, another figure of the devil, drawing weak souls toward him with sweet enticements before consuming them. And here is the small marvel buried in the Whale Island story, the thing I love about it. There is a real phenomenon underneath it that is genuinely eerie. Whales are real. They are enormous. They do surface. And a large whale lying at the surface with part of its dark back exposed could, to a frightened sailor in poor light or heavy weather, resemble a low dark shape on the water. More than that, the deep ocean does produce sudden inexplicable disturbances, upwellings, the surfacing and diving of great animals, patches of water that behave strangely, and a world that had no scientific framework for any of it was left to explain a violent ship-swamping event with a story. And the island we landed on was actually a monster, and it dove is, honestly, not a bad story to reach for when your ship has been swamped by something you couldn't see. The legend was a way of holding a real terror, the sea's capacity to destroy without warning, inside a shape the mind could grasp. The Whale Island had extraordinary reach, which shows how these sea legends travelled far beyond any single culture. Versions of the deceptive island beast appear across an enormous span of the medieval and ancient world. It is in the physiologus and the bestiaries of Christian Europe, and strikingly similar tales of a giant fish, mistaken for an island turn-up in the seafaring stories of other cultures too, in the voyages of Sinbad in the Arabian Nights, and in the legends associated with Irish monastic voyagers like St. Brendan, whose crew was said to have landed on and celebrated Easter Mass upon the back of a great sea beast, only to feel it stir beneath them. When a story shows up independently across that many seafaring traditions, you're seeing something universal in the human encounter with the ocean, the same real terror, the sea that can swallow you whole, being processed into the same shape by sailors who never met, all of them reaching for a living island to explain the water's treachery. Now for a creature I find genuinely delightful in its specificity, the Sarah, or sawfish, which the bestiaries described as a great winged sea monster that races ships. The Sarah was said to have enormous wing-like fins, and when it saw a ship sailing by it would spread these wings and rise up to race alongside the vessel, keeping pace with it out of some competitive urge, flying over the surface of the water beside the sail. But the Sarah could not sustain the effort, and after a few miles it would tire, fold its wings and sink back down into the depths defeated, unable to keep up with the ship it had challenged. The moral, of course, was ready and waiting. The Sarah is the soul that begins the Christian life with great enthusiasm, spreading its wings and racing forward full of zeal, but who lacks the endurance to see it through, who tires when the effort becomes long and hard, and who sinks back down into the depths of sin, having started well but failed to persevere. The lesson was about endurance, about the fact that beginning the race is not the same as finishing it. The rest of the medieval ocean was populated on a simple and revealing principle, the assumption that the sea contained a version of every creature found on the land. This was a genuine organizing idea, not a joke, the belief that the waters mirrored the earth, and that for every land animal there existed a corresponding sea animal, a marine counterpart living beneath the waves. So the medieval sea was thought to hold seahorses and sea dogs, sea lions and sea pigs, sea monks and sea bishops. creatures shaped like the land animals they were named for but living in the water, a whole submarine echo of the terrestrial world. Some of these had a thread of reality behind them, since real animals like seals and walruses and various fish could be pressed into the roles, and a walrus or a monk seal glimpsed briefly really could suggest a sea monk to a hopeful observer, but the principle itself was the fantasy. The ocean was imagined as a reflection of the land, a mirror world where God had duplicated his creation in a different element, and this let medieval writers populate the water with as many creatures as there were animals on the earth simply by adding sea to the front of each name. The sea bishop and sea monk deserve a moment on their own, because they show just how far the mirror world idea could run before anyone thought to stop it. There were serious reports persisting into the early modern period of creatures pulled from the sea or washed ashore that had the form of a bishop or a monk, a body shaped roughly like a robed clergyman, with something like a mitred head, scaled or finned, presented as a genuine marine counterpart to the churchman of the land. Illustrations were made, accounts were recorded, the creatures were discussed as real discoveries. What lay behind them was almost certainly the misinterpretation of real but unfamiliar animals. A large squid, a stranded ray of some odd species, a seal, a decomposing carcass whose original shape had been distorted by the sea into something that a mind primed by the land and sea mirror idea could read as a robed human figure. The observers weren't lying. They were seeing something real and fitting it into the only framework they had, and that framework told them the sea held a bishop because the land did. What ties this whole watery chapter together is the purity of the conditions that produced it, because the sea is the clearest possible case of the machine we've been watching run all night. Take the recipe from the first chapter, a real phenomenon, a gap in observation, an inherited authority and a moral waiting to be attached, and then remove every possible check more completely than anywhere else on Earth. Because at least with the beaver, you could in principle find a dead one, and at least with the bear the den existed somewhere you might eventually look. The deep sea offered nothing. You could not follow the creature home, could not observe it at leisure, could not dissect what you'd never caught, could not return to verify a single claim. You had only the testimony of frightened men who had survived something enormous and unexplained, and their testimony was, by the nature of the thing, unfalsifiable. So the ocean filled up with living islands and racing sawfish and robed sea clergy, not because medieval people were more credulous about the sea than about the land, but because the sea gave their credulity absolutely nothing to push back against. It was the one place where the imagination could run completely unopposed, and so, predictably, it ran. Chapter 8. Basilisks, Weasels, and Death by Eye Contact. So far tonight, most of the animals we've discussed were real creatures wearing false biographies. Actual geese and beavers and bees misunderstood the basilisk begins, as so much does, with Pliny, who described a small serpent from North Africa so venomous and so deadly that it stood apart from every other creature, and the details Pliny gave became the foundation for 1,000 years of dread. The basilisk, in his account and in the medieval elaborations that followed, was a small snake, not large at all, but crowned with a white marking on its head like a little diadem, which is where its name came from, basiliskos, from the Greek for little king. And this little king was death itself in miniature. Its venom was so potent that it did not need to bite you. Its very presence was lethal. It killed shrubs merely by touching them, and scorched the grass as it passed. It split rocks with its breath, and most famously of all, it could kill a person or an animal with nothing but its gaze, a single glance from the basilisk being enough to strike a living thing dead on the spot. It was poison given a body, a walking zone of death that sterilized the ground it crossed. The catalogue of the basilisk's powers grew more elaborate as the centuries passed, and the medieval versions piled on details that made it more terrifying and more absurd in equal measure. Its poison was said to travel up a weapon. If a man on horseback speared a basilisk, the venom would run up the length of the spear and kill not only the rider, but the horse beneath him, so that even killing the creature at a distance offered no safety. Its breath was fatal. The mere smell of it could destroy. A basilisk placed in a well was said to poison the entire water supply and render a place uninhabitable. And the deadly gaze acquired a crucial refinement that would matter enormously to its legend. The basilisk's look killed, but if the creature saw its own reflection, the lethal gaze would rebound upon itself, and the basilisk would die from its own deadly stare bounced back by a mirror. The monster carried the seed of its own destruction in the very weapon that made it invincible, which is the kind of satisfying logical wrinkle the medieval imagination adored. The origin story that developed for the basilisk is one of the strangest pieces of reproductive biology the Middle Ages produced, and it links the creature to a whole cluster of anxieties about unnatural birth. The basilisk, it came to be believed, was hatched from an egg laid by a rooster, a cock's egg, itself an impossibility and an omen, which was then incubated by a serpent or a toad. An old male chicken, in other words, would occasionally and unnaturally produce an egg, and if that egg were brooded by a reptile, out of it would come this crowned engine of death. The unnaturalness was the whole point. A creature born from a violation of the proper order of things, a male producing an egg, a bird's egg hatched by a snake, was fittingly a creature of pure destruction, its monstrous nature written into its monstrous conception. The basilisk was what you got when the rules were broken at the very moment of a creature's making, and the horror of the beast was in a sense a horror about generation gone wrong. Now, every monster in a well-ordered world needs a weakness, because a truly unkillable creature breaks the sense that creation is balanced and governable, and the basilisk was given 3, each more revealing than the last. The first was the mirror, which we've met. Turn its own gaze back on it, and it dies. The second was the crowing of a rooster, which for reasons never fully explained was fatal to the basilisk. A lovely irony given that the creature was hatched from a rooster's egg, so that the sound of its own unnatural parent was its undoing, and travellers crossing basilisk country were advised to carry a cockerel with them for protection. But the third weakness is the one that mattered most and that I want to dwell on, because it introduces our second animal. The basilisk could be killed by the weasel. Alone among all creatures, the humble weasel was immune, or nearly so, to the basilisk's power, and could hunt and destroy the little king of serpents where nothing else dared approach it. The weasel versus basilisk belief is a wonderful example of a very old idea surviving intact into the Middle Ages, because it comes straight from Pliny, who reported that the weasel was thrown into the basilisk's hole to kill it, and that the two would destroy each other, the weasel dying in the process but taking the monster with it. The reasoning behind the pairing almost certainly reaches back to a real animal relationship. The mongoose, in the regions where these stories originated, genuinely does hunt and kill venomous snakes, including cobras, with remarkable success, and the weasel of the European tradition seems to be a stand-in for that real snake-killing predator. The memory of an actual animal that could take on a serpent and win, transplanted into the fantastical framework of the basilisk. So even here, in the heart of the invented ecosystem, there's a thread of reality. The true fact that a small, quick mammal really can kill a deadly snake, stretched and mythologized into the one creature capable of slaying the king of poison. The weasel came with its own baggage of strange belief, and its reproduction was the subject of one of the odder claims in the whole tradition. A claim that shows how the medieval mind kept reaching for unusual modes of conception to explain animals it didn't understand. The weasel was widely believed to conceive its young through its mouth, and give birth through its ear, or in other versions to conceive through the ear and give birth through the mouth, an idea that treated the animal's reproduction as running through its head rather than its body. This peculiar belief did real theological work, because the weasel was thought to conceive by the mouth, through hearing or through the word. It was sometimes read as a figure of those who eagerly receive the word of God but then fail to hold on to it, letting it pass out the other side, hearing the teaching but not keeping it. The seed received through the ear and lost, the lesson taken in and let go. A false piece of biology, once again, pressed immediately into service as a lesson about the reception of Christian teaching. The mouth and ear idea wasn't confined to the weasel, and tracing where it came from reveals the deeper mechanism at work in this whole invented menagerie. The notion of conception through the ear had a powerful and specific resonance in medieval Christianity, because there was a serious and widespread theological tradition holding that the Virgin Mary conceived Christ through her ear, that the Word of God, carried on the angel's speech at the Annunciation, entered Mary through her hearing, so that she conceived by the ear as she received the divine message. This idea, conceptio per aurum, appeared in hymns and sermons and theological writing, and once such a mode of conception was thinkable at the very centre of the faith. Applied to the most sacred event in the Christian story, its echo in the animal kingdom became far less strange. If the word could enter through the ear in the highest instance imaginable, Why not in some lower and stranger form in the weasel? The theology at the centre licensing the biology at the margins, the two feeding each other. Around the basilisk and the weasel clustered a whole society of other lethal and strange creatures, and it's worth gathering a few to show how densely populated this deadly ecosystem was. There was the amphispina, a serpent with a head at each end of its body, able to move in either direction, one head sleeping while the other kept watch, and reportedly able to roll along by taking one head in the other's mouth and forming a hoop. There was the catoblepa, a heavy-headed African beast whose gaze, like the basilisk's, was said to be deadly, and which kept its lethal head permanently lowered toward the ground, mercifully, so that its killing eyes were pointed down. There was the asp, which stopped up its own ears against the charmer's music, pressing one ear to the ground and covering the other with its tail. Red as the sinner who deliberately refuses to hear the word of salvation, stopping his ears against the truth he does not wish to receive. Each creature came with its habits, its weaknesses, and its moral, all catalogued with the same confident precision applied to real animals. What ties this whole invented bestiary together, and what I find most impressive about it despite every error, is its coherence. The way it hangs together as a functioning natural order rather than a random pile of monsters. The basilisk is deadly, but has three specific weaknesses. The weasel is the appointed hunter that exploits one of them. The creatures have origins, enemies, habits, and vulnerabilities that fit together into something that behaves like a real ecosystem, with predators and prey and balance, even though almost none of its members ever existed. The medieval mind did not simply believe in scattered monsters. It built them into a system, gave the king of serpents a natural predator and a mirror to fear, and a rooster's crow to dread, worked out how the poison travelled and how the creature was born and what could kill it, reasoning about entirely fictional animals with the full rigour it would apply to real ones. And that, in the end, is the most human thing about the whole deadly menagerie. Faced with a monster it had invented, the medieval imagination could not rest until it had also invented the thing that could kill the monster, because a world where even death by eye contact had a natural enemy was a world that still, at bottom, made sense. Chapter 9. The Menagerie of the Almost Real. There's a particular category of medieval animal belief that I find more interesting than either the misunderstood real animals or the pure inventions, and it sits in the gap between the two. The creatures Europeans half believed in because they genuinely heard of something real, something that actually existed out in the wide world, and then mangled the description across so many retellings and so many miles that what arrived at home was a strange composite of truth and error. These are the almost real animals, the ones with a solid, factual seed buried inside a fantastical shell, and they're revealing precisely because you can watch the distortion happen. You can see the real elephant, or the real rhinoceros, or the real narwhal at the far end of a long chain of hearsay, arriving in Europe as something recognisable and wrong. Tonight we'll trace three of them. The unicorn, whose myth was propped up by a very real and very valuable object. The elephant, a genuine animal loaded with impossible habits, and a scattering of horned and antlered beasts whose descriptions wandered somewhere between the menagerie and the fever dream. Begin with the unicorn, the most famous of all medieval mythical animals, because the unicorn is a perfect case study in how a real thing can keep a false belief alive for centuries. The medieval unicorn was not the gentle rainbow creature of the modern imagination. It was described as a fierce, wild, untamable beast, small in some accounts, closer to a goat or a young horse than a great steed, with a single long horn projecting from its forehead, so strong and swift and dangerous that no hunter could take it by force. But the unicorn had one fatal weakness, and this is the heart of its legend. It could be captured only by a virgin. If a young virgin were placed alone in the forest where the unicorn lived, the fierce creature would grow gentle at the sight of her, approach, and lay its head in her lap, at which point it fell quiet and could be seized by the hunters who had been lying in wait. The moral reading was immediate and central to the whole tradition. The unicorn was Christ, untamable and powerful, who consented to be captured only through the Virgin, who came to earth and took flesh in the womb of the Virgin Mary, growing gentle and approachable through her, and who was then seized and put to death. The unicorn's capture was the incarnation and the passion in a single hunting scene. What kept the unicorn alive as a believed-in animal, rather than a mere symbol, was the trade in its horn, and this is where the almost real quality becomes concrete and financial. Throughout the medieval period there was a genuine market in what was sold as unicorn horn, alicorn, long, straight, spiralled tusks presented as the actual horns of unicorns, and these objects were staggeringly valuable, worth many times their weight in gold, because unicorn horn was believed to have extraordinary powers, chiefly the power to detect and neutralize poison. A cup made of unicorn horn was thought to reveal poison in any drink poured into it, and powdered unicorn horn was sold as a medicine and a universal antidote, which meant that for a wealthy medieval noble living in genuine fear of assassination by poison, a piece of unicorn horn was not a curiosity, but a serious investment in survival. These horns appeared in the treasuries of kings and cathedrals, were given as diplomatic gifts of the highest order, and were guarded like the treasures they were considered to be. The catch, of course, is that the horns were real objects with a completely real origin that had nothing to do with unicorns. They were the tusks of the narwhal, a real Arctic whale whose males grow a single long, straight, spiraled tusk that looks exactly like the horn the unicorn was supposed to have. Narwhals live in the far northern seas, and Norse traders and northern peoples who hunted them had access to these remarkable tusks, which they could sell southward into Europe without necessarily revealing, or perhaps without themselves fully knowing, where the objects truly came from. So a real animal at the top of the world, the narwhal, was quietly supplying the physical evidence that kept a mythical animal believed in across the whole continent, and the spiral tusk of a whale no European had ever seen became, in cathedral treasuries and royal collections, the horn of a beast no European had ever seen either. The unicorn was sustained by a genuine object honestly mistaken, one real animal's anatomy propping up another animal's myth, which is the almost real dynamic in its purest and most lucrative form. Turn now to the elephant, which is the opposite kind of case. A completely real animal, known to exist, occasionally even seen in Europe, and yet buried under a heap of impossible beliefs that persisted despite the creature's reality. The most famous and most durable of these was the belief that the elephant had no knee joints, that its legs were single rigid columns without the ability to bend, and that in consequence the elephant could not lie down and could not get up again if it fell. From this followed the crucial detail. Because the elephant could not lie down to sleep, it was said to sleep standing up, leaning against a tree, and hunters, knowing this, would soar partway through the trunk of the elephant's favourite tree, so that when the great beast leaned against it to rest, the tree would give way and the elephant would crash to the ground, unable to rise again, helpless, easy prey. The elephant, trapped by its own supposed inability to stand back up, was caught by the sabotage of the one thing it needed to rest against. This too was fitted with a moral, and the elephant's fall was read as the fall of man. The great elephant that cannot raise itself once fallen was humanity, fallen through sin and unable to rise again by its own strength, needing another to lift it up. And the bestiaries supplied the rescuer within the elephant's own imagined behaviour, describing how, when a fallen elephant cried out, first a large elephant would come and try to lift it and fail, and then finally a small elephant would come and succeed in raising the fallen one, read as the succession of the law and the prophets who could not save fallen humanity, and finally the coming of Christ, the small one, who lifts man up where the great ones could not. The elephant carried other beliefs too, that elephants were mortal enemies of dragons, locked in epic combat, that they were creatures of great chastity and modesty, mating rarely and reluctantly and only for the purpose of offspring, which made them like the bee a model of continence, and that they were terrified of mice, a belief with a surprisingly long life. The knee-joint error, meanwhile, likely came from observing that elephants' legs are unusually straight and pillar-like compared to other animals, and from the genuine fact that elephants rarely lie down and can look, at rest, as though they never bend at all, a real visual impression pushed to a false anatomical conclusion. The horned and antlered beasts round out the menagerie, and they show the almost real distortion working on animals that plainly existed, but had been described second-hand into strangeness. There was the antelopes of the bestiaries, described as having two long serrated horns like saws, with which it could cut down trees, and which came to grief through those very horns. Coming to a certain riverbank thicket to play, it would tangle its saw-like horns in the branches and the shoots of the shrubs, trap itself hopelessly, and cry out until hunters came and killed it, an image of the sinner ensnared by the tangling vices of the world. There was the rhinoceros, sometimes conflated with the unicorn and sometimes given its own entry, described as a beast of immense strength, with a single horn on its nose, so fierce it could only be tamed, again, by a virgin. The unicorn's virgin capture motif migrating onto its real-world cousin, and there was the ibex, praised for the great curved horns on which it was said to throw itself when it fell from a height, landing on its horns to absorb the impact and survive the fall unhurt, read as a lesson about being sustained by the two testaments of Scripture. Real animals, everyone, with real horns, described by people who had heard about them rather than watched them, until the horns grew sawteeth, and the falling goat learned to land on its head. What makes this whole, almost real category so instructive is that it shows the medieval era machine working on the best possible raw material and still producing fantasy, which tells you something important about the whole enterprise. With the pure inventions like the basilisk, you can say the medieval mind had nothing true to work from, and so of course it went astray. But the elephant was real. The rhinoceros was real. The narwhal that supplied the unicorn's horn was real. These beliefs failed not for lack of a true foundation, but because the distance between the animal and the European who wrote about it was too great to cross without distortion, because knowledge travelled by hearsay across thousands of miles and hundreds of retellings, each teller adding, simplifying, moralizing, misremembering, until the real straight-legged elephant became the elephant that cannot bend its knees, and the real spiral-tusked whale became the poison-detecting horn of a virgin-loving beast. The failure was a failure of transmission, not of raw material, and it's the clearest possible illustration of the point we started with in the first chapter. In a world without a way to go and check, even a true animal at the source will arrive at the destination as a legend because every hand it passes through leaves a fingerprint, and by the end there are 1,000 fingerprints and no elephant. Chapter 10. When the animal went on trial. We've spent 9 chapters on what medieval Europeans believed about animals, and for this final one I want to turn to what they did about them, because there is no better proof of how seriously the period took the animal kingdom than the astonishing, thoroughly documented fact that medieval and early modern Europe put animals on trial, dragged them into real courtrooms, appointed real lawyers to defend them, heard real testimony, and handed down real sentences, sometimes of death. This was not a folk custom practiced by ignorant villagers in some forgotten corner. It was a formal legal procedure, conducted by the actual courts of the day, recorded in the actual legal record, stretching across several centuries and much of the continent, and it survives today largely because a 19th century scholar named E.P. Evans gathered the cases together into a book that remains the great catalogue of the whole strange phenomenon. Tonight, to close, we watch pigs stand trial for murder, rats receive a formal summons to court, and swarms of insects face excommunication by the church. And then, when we've seen the full sweep of it, I'll wish you a proper good night. The animal trials fell into 2 quite distinct kinds, and it matters to keep them separate because they came from different institutions and rested on different logic. The first kind were secular trials, held in ordinary criminal courts, and these were reserved almost entirely for individual domestic animals, overwhelmingly pigs, that had killed or injured a human being. A pig that killed a person was arrested, imprisoned in the same jail that held human criminals, formally charged, tried according to the same procedures used for people, and if convicted, executed, usually by hanging or by being burned, and the whole thing was treated with complete legal seriousness. The second kind were ecclesiastical trials, held in church courts, and these dealt with groups of animals, usually pests, rats and mice and insects and the like, that were damaging crops or otherwise plaguing a community, and the church's ultimate weapon against them was not execution but excommunication, or a formal curse, an attempt to drive the creatures out by spiritual authority. 2 systems, 2 kinds of defendant, 2 very different tools, both taking for granted that an animal could be a party to a legal proceeding. The pig trials are the most vivid, and the reason pigs dominate the record is straightforwardly practical rather than symbolic. Medieval pigs were not the confined animals of a modern farm, but roamed relatively freely through villages and streets, large, powerful, semi-feral and hungry, and they genuinely did sometimes attack and kill people, most heartbreakingly infants and small children left unattended. So the pig was the animal most likely to actually commit something a court would recognise as homicide, and the courts responded exactly as they would to a human killer. One of the best documented cases comes from Falaise, in Normandy, in 1386, where a sow was tried for killing an infant. The animal was convicted, and in a detail that captures the whole grim logic of the thing, the sow was reportedly dressed in human clothes for its execution and put to death in the public square, hanged or mangled in a deliberate mirror of the injuries it had inflicted, the punishment fitting the crime as precisely as it would have for a person. The town paid the executioner for the job at the same rate he'd have earned for dispatching a human criminal, and the accounts recording that payment are part of how we know the case is real. The procedures were not casual or perfunctory, and this is the part that most surprises people because the animals were often given genuine legal defence. In the ecclesiastical trials especially, the accused creatures were assigned defence counsel, real lawyers, sometimes quite prominent ones, tasked with mounting the best possible case on behalf of the rats or the weevils or the flies. The most celebrated of these defenders was a French jurist named Bartholomew Chassenet, who made his early reputation in the early 16th century defending the rats of the Diocese of Autun, which had been summoned to answer for destroying the barley crop. When the rats failed to appear in court as summoned, Chassenet did not concede. He argued with real legal ingenuity that his clients could not reasonably be expected to appear because the journey was too dangerous. The roads between the rats' scattered homes and the courthouse were patrolled by cats, and no defendant could be required to risk his life to answer a summons. He argued that the summons had been improperly served because it had not reached every affected rat, and that the defendants deserved more time. He was, in other words, using the full machinery of legal procedure on behalf of vermin, and using it well, and the arguments were entered into the record and taken seriously by the court. The mechanics of summoning creatures that obviously could not read or appear produced some genuinely remarkable moments, because the courts worked out formal procedures for exactly that problem. When a church court proceeded against a population of pests, it would issue a proper legal summons ordering the animals to appear or to depart the area by a certain date, and this summons would be publicly proclaimed, sometimes read aloud in the fields the creatures infested, sometimes posted where the infestation was worst. If the animals did not comply, the court could proceed to admonitions, then to warnings, and finally to the ultimate ecclesiastical sanctions, a formal curse, an anathema, or excommunication cast upon the offending swarm, commanding them in the name of the church to leave, and threatening them with spiritual penalties if they refused. There was theological unease about this, it should be said. Careful churchmen debated whether it was even proper to excommunicate a creature that had never been baptized and could not be a member of the church in the first place, and some argued the proper instrument was a curse or an exorcism rather than a true excommunication. But the debate itself is the point. Learned clergy were arguing in earnest about the correct legal spiritual procedure for prosecuting insects. The cases stretch across an astonishing range of creatures and a long span of time, and a few examples convey the sheer scope of it. There were trials of weevils that had damaged vineyards, dragged out over years of legal wrangling, prosecutions of caterpillars, of locusts, of leeches, of field mice, of moles, of flies. There were cases against larger animals too, cows, horses, dogs, and in one grim and revealing category, cases where animals were tried alongside humans in crimes the period regarded with particular horror, the animal executed together with the person as a co-participant. The trials were not confined to one country. They turn up in France, in Italy, in Switzerland, in Germany, across the Low Countries, and they persist not just through the medieval period, but well into the early modern era, with cases recorded into the 16th and 17th centuries and a scattering even later, so that this was not a brief medieval aberration soon outgrown, but a durable feature of European legal life that lasted for the better part of 1,000 years. The natural question is how anyone thought this made sense, and the answer takes us right back to the theme that has run through every chapter tonight. The medieval conviction that the world was a fundamentally ordered and meaningful place, governed throughout by law both human and divine. If the entire cosmos was a moral order established by God, then a creature that killed a child or destroyed a harvest had disrupted that order, had committed a real offence against the way things were meant to be, and the disruption had to be formally addressed, named, judged, and set right through the proper legal channels, because to let it pass unaddressed was to let a wound in the moral fabric of the world go untreated. The trial was not really about deterring other pigs who would not be watching and could not be warned. It was about the community reasserting that the world was lawful, that transgression had consequences, that even a catastrophe caused by a mere animal fit into a framework of justice rather than into meaningless chaos. Prosecuting the sow was a way of insisting that the death of the child was not random, that it belonged to an order in which such things were answered. And there is something in that, I think, that keeps the animal trials from being merely absurd, that lifts them into something almost moving, which is the right note to end our whole long night on. For 9 chapters we have watched the medieval mind get the natural world magnificently wrong, grow geese on trees, castrate beavers for the sake of a sermon, hand the beehive a king, drown sailors on the backs of whales, arm antelopes with saws and kill men with the glance of a rooster's monstrous child. And it would be the easiest thing in the world to file all of it under the heading of a credulous age that simply didn't know any better. But underneath every single one of these errors ran the same deep and rather beautiful assumption, that the world was densely, thoroughly meaningful, that nothing in it was accidental or mute, that every creature carried a lesson, and every event fit into an order, and even the animals were bound, along with us, into a single vast web of significance and lore. They were wrong about the geese and the beavers and the bees, wrong about the sea and the basilisk and the elephant's knees, wrong in ways that are genuinely funny and that we've had a lovely time laughing at together tonight, but they were never wrong to believe the world was worth taking seriously, worth reading closely, worth treating as though it meant something. That instinct, the refusal to see the world as random, is the same instinct that eventually built the sciences that corrected every error we've discussed, and I find I can't quite look down on it, even at its most ridiculous. So that is where we'll leave them, and where I'll leave you, with a medieval sow standing trial in a village square, gravely accused, properly defended, judged by people who believed with all their hearts that the universe was a place where even this had to be answered for, because everything, in the end, meant something. Thank you for spending these hours with me here in the quiet. It's a genuine pleasure to sit up late with the strange and earnest people of the past and let their world wash over us as we drift. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close. The fire's low, the bestiary is back on its shelf, the geese are asleep in whatever tree they came from, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.